Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's study in a series of Spiritism viewed through transpersonal psychology. I'm Fabrício Assunção from the Spiritual Society of Bournemouth. These studies are an international collaboration between the Spiritist Society of Bournemouth in England, the Brazilian Spiritist Medical Association, and the Spiritist Institute from the United States of America. Tonight, we welcome Marluce Hans and Claudia Semeghini, who will be leading our study of chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew in the Holy Bible, which deals with the sayings of Jesus known as the Beatitudes. The title of their talk is Individuation, Happiness, and Beatitudes. Marluce and Claudia will be speaking in Portuguese, so we are pleased to welcome again Dr. Dana Sisi, who will be giving us a translation into English. We will have a time for questions and answers, where all questions will be asked through the Zoom chat. Let me introduce you our speakers. Marluce Hans has a postgraduate degree in Jungian clinical psychology. He's a member of the Jungian Institute of Rio Grande do Sul, the Brazilian Jungian Association, and the International Association for Analytical Psychology. Also, she's a member of the Psychology and Spiritism group of the Medical Spiritist Association of Rio Grande do Sul and the Spiritist Medical Association of Brazil. Claudia Semeghini has a postgraduate degree in Jungian psychology. She's a certified Jungian analyst, a member of the International Association for Analytical Psychology, the Psychology and Spiritist group of the Spiritist Medical Association of Brazil, the Department of Analytical Psychology and New Spirituality of the Brazilian Jungian Association, and the Department of Spirituality and Jung Institute of Rio de Janeiro. Claudia is a national and international speaker and is an author of several books. She's also an art therapist. Dr. Dan Assis has a doctorate degree in education. He is the founding member of the Spiritist Institute in the United States of America. He is also an author and gives public talks on spirituality and spiritism in the United States and internationally. Now, I hand it over to our guest speakers for tonight's study on individualization, happiness, and the Beatitudes. Over to you, Marluce, Claudia, and Dan.
Então, é uma alegria estarmos aqui com vocês nessa noite, né? E a nossa proposta é
It is a
nós
pleasure to be here with you this evening.
juntos, né, podermos nos
And
aprofundar
our
nesses
proposals for us
ensinamentos,
together
nesses grandes ensinamentos desse
to
grande
dive
psicólogo
deeper
que nós
into this
temos,
great
que é
teachings, this
Jesus.
great psychologist that we
Então,
have, that
a
is
nossa
Jesus
proposta
Christ.
é fazermos essa conversa
So, our
entre
idea
esse
for tonight
conceito de
is to have this
individuação,
conversation
tanto
about this concept of
quanto durante esse
individuation
trabalho,
that both
que
Young
nós
and
entendemos
Joanna
como
de Angelis expand
felicidade,
on,
e
and
as
which we understand as happiness,
bem-aventuranças, que
and the
são um
Beatitudes,
tratado sobre a felicidade.
which are a
Então, eu e a
treaty
Cláudia hoje estamos aqui para
on happiness.
trazermos algumas reflexões para vocês.
So today we are bringing some reflections.
Boa noite a todos. É uma alegria estar com todos vocês aqui nesta noite.
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here with you tonight.
Falam de experiências pessoais de Jesus.
The Beatitudes talk about personal experiences that Jesus had, of his communion with God, his state of connection with the Father, this Father of love that he brought to us. So, in many ways, they are a song of love, of compassion that he directed towards us. And to all those who were suffering, who followed him in his walks, who wanted to be with him and to drink from his words. So it is a great pleasure to be here tonight and talk about this, which is a self-portrait of Jesus. And he speaks to us about his heart. And it's very important nowadays for us to listen to his message and that it may take hold in our hearts. So along those lines, for us to dive into this atmosphere that Jesus brings us, we invite you for a brief prayer.
vendo a multidão,
And
subiu ao
Jesus,
monte
seeing the
e
crowd,
assentando-se, aproximaram-se
went up the
dele seus
mountain, sat,
discípulos e
and his
abrindo
disciples
sua
approached,
boca,
and
ensinava.
opening his mouth, he would teach, saying,
Bem-aventurados os pobres de espírito,
Blessed are the
porque
poor in
deles é o reino
spirit,
dos céus.
because theirs is the kingdom of
Bem-aventurados os
heaven.
que choram, porque eles
Blessed
serão
are those who
consolados.
cry, for they shall be comforted.
Bem-aventurados os mansos,
Blessed
porque eles
are the
herdarão a terra.
peace and the meek, for they will inherit the earth.
Bem-aventurados os que têm fome e
Blessed
sede de
are those
justiça,
who thirst and
porque
hunger for
eles serão
justice,
fartos.
because they will be
Bem-aventurados os
satisfied.
misericordiosos,
Blessed
porque
are
eles
those who are
alcançarão a
merciful,
misericórdia.
because they will reach mercy.
Bem-aventurados os puros de coração,
Blessed are
porque
those who are
eles
pure
verão
of
Deus.
heart, because they will see God.
Bem-aventurados os pacificadores,
Blessed are the
porque eles serão
peacemakers,
chamados filhos de Deus.
because they will be called children of
Bem-aventurados os
God.
que sofrem perseguição por
Blessed
causa
are
da
those who are
justiça,
persecuted for
porque
justice,
deles é o reino dos céus.
because theirs is the kingdom of heavens.
Bem-aventurados sois vós, quando
Blessed
vos
are you
humilharem e perseguirem,
when they
e
hurt you and
mentirem,
persecute you,
falarem todo
and
mal
lying,
contra vós
they say
por
all
minha
kinds of
causa.
evils against you because of
Exultai
me.
e alegrai-vos,
Be
porque
happy and
grande é o
rejoice,
vosso galardão nos céus,
because
porque
great is your
assim
reward in
perseguiram os
heaven,
profetas que vieram antes de nós.
because
Antes de
as
vós.
such also suffer the prophets that came before you.
Vocês
Com isso,
conseguem perguntar ao pessoal se eles estão conseguindo ver o slide?
We're just making sure the folks can see the slides. Yes, they
Ok,
can.
que bom. Pois não, Marluce?
então, com isso, né, Cláudia, nós podíamos começar trazendo esse conceito de bem-aventurança.
So we may
né?
start
E
with
qual é o
the concept
contexto em
of
que
these blessings,
Jesus
these beatitudes,
traz a
and the
sua
context
mensagem.
in which Jesus brings these
Então,
messages.
a gente pode pensar que quando Jesus vem,
And so we
quem
can
é que
say
eles estavam esperando? Eles estavam esperando um
that when
grande
Jesus comes, who were they
que
expecting? They
tinha,
were
então,
expecting a
toda
great
essa
Messiah.
expectativa, né, de um líder político, né,
And they had all this
de um
expectation of a
líder
political
que
leader,
tomaria o poder, né,
a,
para o povo
a leader who will
judeu.
take the power
E
back to the
Jesus
Jewish
se
people.
apresenta como esse homem simples, com
And
uma
Jesus presents
linguagem extremamente
himself
acessível, né,
as a simple
trazendo
man
uma
with an easy to
mensagem
understand language,
absolutamente
bringing a
inovadora,
message that was
amorosa,
new and
justamente se
loving,
contrapondo a toda aquela expectativa de poder que
being
havia.
a counterpart to
Então,
all the
Jesus
expectation of
traz
power that
uma
was
nova
expected
atmosfera,
of him. And
né?
Jesus
E
brings us a new
que é
atmosphere,
tão profunda e transformadora que até hoje nós
which is
estamos
so deep, so
vivenciando e
profound, and
sentimos isso,
so
né, em nossos corações,
transformative that to this
quando
day
nos
we still
aproximamos
feel that in our hearts,
né, e desses
and we
ensinamentos
still
que aos poucos
try
nós
to
começamos
understand
a
these
desvendar.
teachings,
E
and that
o
only now we're beginning
conceito
to
de
unveil.
bem-aventurado é
And
conceito
the
bem
idea of these
assim,
beatitudes,
antigo,
of
ou seja,
blessings, of being
feliz. É isso que Jesus
happy,
vai nos falar a cada
and that I think
início
that is
de
what Jesus
bem-aventurança, ele
will
nos traz.
tell us
Sejam
in the
benditos,
beginning of
sejam
every
felizes aqueles
sentence
que...
he utters.
Então ele vai nos adentrando nesse estado de felicidade.
So he comes to
felicidade
us
verdadeira
with
que
the
todos
state
nós
of
buscamos.
plenitude, of true happiness that we
E o
all
contexto,
search
né,
for.
Marluce, o contexto que ele traz as bem-aventuranças
And the context in which he
é
brings
contexto
all the
onde ele desce
blessings,
ele
it is a
sai
context in
de
which
momento
he
onde ele estava íntimo
is
com o
exiting a
Pai,
moment
estava
where
nas
he was in
reflexões,
intimacy
ele
with
buscava,
God
ele
in
se
his
afastava da
reflections
multidão e ia encontrar-se com
as
o
he
Pai.
would
Era um
move away
momento de
from the
conexão com o
crowd
Pai.
and
Então,
connect with
quando ele
God.
volta,
And when he
né,
comes
e
back
ele encontra aquela multidão
and he finds that
desejando
crowd
alívio para os
who
seus
is
sofrimentos,
searching for
ele vai
comfort,
inundado num
he
oceano de amor,
comes
num oceano
drenched
de
in an ocean
paz,
of
num
love,
oceano
of
de
peace,
plenitude, depois
of
daquele encontro com
plenitude,
o Pai.
after he
E
had
aí,
that
depois
time
desse
to
encontro
connect
com
with
o
God.
Pai, então
And
ele
after
vem
that,
distribuir para todos
he
aqueles
comes to
que agora estão
distribute
sedentos,
to all
ele vai
those who are
distribuir a
thirsty, waiting for his words.
a
He comes to
paz
share
que ele
the
irradiava, a
love, the
felicidade,
peace, the light, the
a
happiness,
plenitude de
that radiated normally from him, this plenitude that he had while he connected with God. And it is within that context that we are going to find him sitting in that mount upon which all the people were waiting for him, nearing him to feel his wonderful energy. And as he sits down, and what does that mean, this movement of sitting down? It is the moment of settling, of leaving that status that he found himself and coming down to be with that crowd that was so in need of words. So as he comes down from that connection with God to connect with the people, he can then help them ascend to the Father. This is, in a way, reminds me of a movement of children. Children is shorter, and so when we speak from the top, we sometimes don't reach their eyes. We need to lower ourselves, to knee down, to look at their eyes, so that we can be in the same level. And this is what this moment reminds me of, without a doubt. And if we look at the Beatitudes as a treatise on happiness, we will need to understand the concept of happiness. And along those lines, also deal with a very important concept that Joanna de Angelis works on in her psychological series, which is the concept that Jung brings of individuation. And what is individuation? It is a process of psychological development that takes place throughout our lives. That's why we talk about a process of individuation. So it's an archetypical movement. Our psyche has a goal, has a direction. And this individuation process implies that we need to recognize the meaning for our existence and what is the place that we occupy in life. And this presupposes us working in two levels of consciousness. One being a more limited consciousness, which Jung would call the ego, and a higher conscious, a broader one, which he will then call the self. So when we look at the Beatitudes, we will look using this reality between the ego, this more limited consciousness, and the self, this broader, higher consciousness. If we look at the Beatitudes only through the ego's lenses, it will be very hard for us to truly understand those who are, for instance, blessed because they are poor in spirit, because from the ego's perspective, that would not make a lot of sense. So it's important for us to dive in to this idea of individuation, to comprehend what kind of happiness Jesus is talking about. And for us to go there, we need to ask ourselves some questions to help us get closer to the answers we seek. And these questions are, what does the self want from me? What does the immortal spirit have come to realize? How can I serve the self in a relationship, as you said, between the ego and the self? And as we talk to the self, which is the totality of our psyche, but is also the inhabitants of God within us, our immortal spirit. So the self contains a lot of concepts. So how can I serve this self? How can I bring the spirit of totality to my life and to the world around me? how can I concretize this? How can I bring this or coagulate this as like a chemical term that to make it concrete, to make it palpable, that which we truly desire? So when we think about this work that Marluce was speaking about, to identify the process of an entire life and perhaps many lives, many lives for us to reach a higher level. And when we think about this individual work that we must do, we also think about our contact with the collective. And the collective needs us a lot too.
interessante esse aspecto, Cláudia, que está
Indeed,
trazendo,
Claudia, it's
porque
very
a
important for us to highlight this which you're
ela
bringing,
não ocorre,
because
ela ocorre na
individuation
relação.
happens in
Mais eu vou
relationships
me
or
aproximar
through
do
relationships.
entender do que esse
The
self
more
de
I
mim,
approach the
mais eu vou
concept and
entender
understand
o
the
meu
self
lugar no
that is within
coletivo.
me, I
Então,
find my
como é
place in the
importante
collective.
esse trabalho,
How
de
important it is,
autoconhecimento, de se
this work
debruçar sobre a
of
nossa
self-knowledge,
realidade
of self-discovery,
interna, de nos aproximarmos cada vez mais
of
dessa
approaching
realidade espiritual,
this
que
spiritual
tem uma
reality
compreensão muito mais ampla
that
da
brings us a
realidade. E a
vaster
partir,
comprehension of
então,
reality.
desse processo onde, num primeiro momento, a gente se separa
And so,
da coletividade,
through this
a gente
process
se
in which
encontra
first
e
we detach
volta para a
ourselves from the
coletividade, então,
collective and then return
encontrando o nosso
later,
lugar,
once we find our
nós
place in
começamos a
it,
nos perguntar, mas então,
we
como é
start
que a
to
gente
ask
pode
ourselves,
pensar o que é felicidade?
how can we
Como é que
begin to
cada
think
de
about
nós
what
entende
happiness is?
felicidade?
How does each one of us
Já que a
understands
felicidade,
happiness?
ela parece ser dos grandes
Since
anseios do ser humano.
individuation,
Inclusive,
since happiness seems to be one of our greatest desires. In
conduzidas
fact,
em
there's
Harvard,
one of
sobre a
the oldest
felicidade.
research that we have
Essa
found at
pesquisa
Harvard is
ocorre há
about
mais de
happiness.
80 anos,
And this research has taken place for more than 80 years now and it demonstrates
a mudança das gerações, o que é
how
importante para
generations
cada
understand that over time and what is important to
Os
people.
filósofos também se ocuparam desse
The
conceito de
philosophers have
felicidade.
also tried to
E um
tackle
dos
this
conceitos de
concept of happiness.
felicidade é eudaimonia, proposta
And one of these
por
concepts is that of
Aristóteles,
eudaimonia,
que seria
a
estar
concept proposed by
cheio de
Aristotle,
Então,
which is to be
vejam que do
full
ponto de
of
vista
daemon.
filosófico,
And from a
a
philosophical
felicidade ela
perspective,
é bem
happiness
diferente daquilo que
is
o
very
nosso ego
different
muitas vezes
than that which our
considera
ego
feliz.
sometimes considers as
Nosso
true
ego pode
happiness.
associar
Our ego
felicidade
can associate
com ser
happiness
bem-sucedido,
with being
ter
successful,
prazer na
to
vida,
have
não
pleasures in
ter
life, of
problemas,
not having
não ter
problems,
conflitos.
not having
Enquanto que
conflicts.
eudaimonia é estar cheio de
When the concept of eudaimonia means to be full of daemon, which means full of purpose,
a parte
to
que
find my
importa
daemon,
nessa
the
vida.
role that is
Então, uma
mine in
outra
this life.
perspectiva,
So
Cláudia?
it's a very different perspective, isn't it, Claudia? Indeed, it's an inner perspective, not an outer perspective. The outward word offers us many things, but sometimes they are very empty and are things that do not fulfill or satisfy us. And our soul continues to be thirsty for that meaning and purpose. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a future beatitude today. So this happiness that the world offers us is that which causes anxiety, compulsions, sadness, and sometimes many catastrophes and tragedies in our lives. When people are distanced from true purpose and distance from what really means to be happiness. Happiness is a state of spirit, is not something that cannot fulfill our senses so easily. And I recalled in the beginning of all these sentences when Jesus starts by saying, "Blessed are those, happy are those." That is what Jesus wishes that we achieve. This full happiness, this plenitude, this abundant happiness that brings peace and that finds a place within our hearts and not in the outside world full of distractions and illusions that we live in.
E é interessante, né, que Jung
And it's interesting
dizia que o grande
that Jung used to
desafio
say
do ser humano era
that the
encontrar
great
o
challenge of human
sentido da sua
beings
existência.
is to find
A
the
gente
meaning
tem
of their
acesso
existence.
às cartas que Jung trocava com
We have
colegas,
access to the
com
letters that
pacientes.
Jung wrote to
Isso foi
colleagues, to
publicado
patients,
em 3 volumes aqui no
and this
Brasil.
was
Não
published
sei
in
como é
3
na
different
versão
volumes
inglesa.
in Brazil, and I don't
Mas em
know
um
how the
determinado
English version
carta
is,
que Jung
but
recebe
in one
de
of
uma
those letters
paciente,
that he
essa
receives from
paciente
one of his
descreve assim um
patients,
sofrimento
she
muito grande
describes her
durante quase a vida
suffering
inteira. E
almost her
aí Jung
entire life.
responde para essa
And
pessoa
then Jung
dizendo
replies
assim:
to her saying,
e o que aconteceu com você ao longo da tua
and
vida?
what
Por
happened to
que você
you
encontrou
throughout
um
your
sentido para
life?
isso?
Did you find meaning
Então,
for
quando
that?
Jung propõe a
So when
ideia da
Jung proposes
individuação, né,
the
ele
idea, the
está
concept of
falando da gente
individuation,
encontrar o
he
sentido
is
da nossa
dealing with the
existência.
idea
E
or
muitas
talking about
vezes
the
nessa
idea of
caminhada
finding the
nós não
purpose for
vamos
our
ter só
existence.
momentos felizes.
Because
Então,
oftentimes
a
during our
individuação
journey,
não tem
we
esse
won't have
sentido de
only happy
felicidade
moments.
como
So
nós
individuation does not
imaginamos quando
have
nós
a sense of
pensamos, né?
happiness as we
Porque
think
a
of it.
meta da vida, ele vai
Because
dizer,
the
não é a
purpose of life,
felicidade, mas é
the
o
goal of life is not
significado,
happiness,
né?
but it's
Isso
meaning.
é bastante profundo da gente
And that is
entender.
very deep for
Tanto que ele
us to
dizia que,
conquer
como
and
analista,
contemplate.
a função não
And he used
é
to say that as an
tentar
analyst,
retirar o sofrimento dos
his
pacientes,
function, his
mas
role
ao
was not try
contrário,
to
era
lift suffering
ajudar os
from his patients,
pacientes
but
a
instead
poder
it
suportar
was to
e
help
superar
his
os sofrimentos da
patients
vida,
to
porque a
withstand
vida
that
é assim.
suffering and
Então,
overcome the
o
sufferings of
próprio
life,
conceito de
because life is like
individuação
that.
vai trabalhando essa
So the
ideia do
concept of
sentido e o
individuation
propósito.
works on this
E
idea of
aí
purpose
a
and
gente
meaning,
pode realmente começar a entender esse
that which we
profundo
can begin
ensinamento
to
psicológico
understand
que Jesus
this really
traz
deep
nas duas
psychological
lições sobre
teaching
individuação.
that Jesus brings to
É
us
assim
in the
que e o
Beatitudes.
sofrimento ele tem um sentido tão
Indeed,
adverso, né,
and
tão
this suffering
equivocado,
can
porque
have such a
sofrer dói,
misunderstood
de
meaning,
fato.
because to
Porque
suffer, of
todos nós
course, it is
temos nossos
painful.
sofrimentos
We all have our pain or
particulares,
suffering.
mas como você trouxe, há uma meta,
But
há um
as you
sentido,
spoke,
há um
there is a
significado.
purpose, there is
E
a
a vida não
meaning,
é
there
um
is a
sofrimento.
goal.
O
And
sofrimento
life
é
is not
só
suffering.
uma passagem, uma paragem.
Suffering is a temporary
Quando você
phase of
pergunta para
life.
aquelas pessoas
When
que
we
passaram
ask
uma
people
vida
that
difícil,
went
muitas
through difficult
delas
lives,
não veem sentido, mas
many
outras
people do
veem
not
em que
see
momento
meaning,
elas chegaram.
but
A
others do
maturidade
see in the
psicológica e
maturity that
emocional
they
que elas
reach,
alcançaram
psychologically and
quando
emotionally
elas
speaking,
atravessaram todo esse
when they
percurso de vida.
overcome all this path
Então,
in
o
life.
sofrimento, ele
So
dói,
suffering
mas ele
for
tem
sure hurts,
um sentido e um
but it
significado.
has a purpose and a meaning.
E quando se chega lá na frente, se
When we
entende.
get
Quando um
farther ahead in
resolveu a
life,
nossa visão
sometimes we understand
espiritual,
that when
que é
we
um grande
um,
desafio para todos
broaden our
nós, que
perspective
nós entramos
of
nesse
the world
plano
as immortal
muitas
spirits, which
vezes
is
nós
one of our
esquecemos
greatest
que estamos no
challenges as we
passado,
come
que
into
somos
the
aqui
physical
por
body,
tempo,
we forget that we are
nós
here
vivemos a vida
temporarily and that we are an
chegando,
immortal
nós
spirit and we
vemos
live in the
agora
here
e o
now.
sofrimento como um
But when we're able
sentido,
to
como
see
uma
suffering with
verdade,
purpose
como um
and meaning,
aprendizado,
with an
isso vai
opportunity for learning,
potencializado, porque nós
this
encontramos,
allows
no
us
fim,
to better
a
understand
justificativa, né, o
things
significado.
and the meaning for it all.
Isso nos diz, né, Cláudia, que nós não podemos
And
dar
Claudia, that
felicidade
also
para
tells
ninguém.
us that we're
A
not able to grant
felicidade,
happiness to
ela vem
anybody
dessa
else.
capacidade que cada um de nós tem
And
de
the happiness
extrair
comes from
daí o
our own
sentido e o
ability to
significado das
extract this meaning
experiências da
and this
vida.
purpose from the
E
experiences that
Joana
life
de
brings to
Ângeles,
us.
no livro
And
Ser
Joanna de Angelis,
Consciente,
in her book, The
ela tem um
Conscious Being,
capítulo só sobre a
gives us a
felicidade.
chapter
E ali
just
ela
around
dá uma
happiness.
definição de
And in
felicidade
it,
que é
she
muito
defines
interessante. Ela
happiness that is
diz
very
que a
interesting.
felicidade é
She
a
says
harmonia
that
entre o ego
happiness
e o
is the
ser.
harmony between the
E
ego and
eu
the self.
fiquei refletindo muito sobre
And I have
essa
reflected quite a
proposição
bit
dela, né?
about this
Porque
proposition that
então
she
ela está
brings,
falando
because what
desse
she's
ego, dessa
saying,
nossa
she's
personalidade
talking about
complexa,
our ego, our personality, of having the ability to withstand, to be patient, to hear what comes from the self. So these two instances, the ego and the self, be able to manifest each one of them in different ways. Not in a contradictory way, but as you were saying, Claudia, a lot of the things that we consider suffering sometimes is just our limited vision, only the limited vision that our ego has. But when Joanna de Angelis proposes this harmony between the ego and the self as a concept of happiness, she's also bringing happiness as this broader sense of purpose and meaning. And this ego is capable of understanding that. And you also brought a very powerful word, which is to withstand. How often do we need to withstand or bear this pain? So once more, we can think about the painful passage of Jesus in the Calvary and his revelation that life goes on. And we have the symbol of the cross, of the crucifixion. So to bear is to be crucified. So many times this crucifixion is not understood while we're going through the moment. But when we're able to look back and reevaluate things, we can understand that journey. And I remember now that image in that beautiful saying or poetry of footsteps in the sand, in which Jesus walked with somebody on the beach, and the person says, "Many times I see that there are 2 set of footprints on the beach, but sometimes only once. Why have you abandoned me in that moment?" And Jesus replies, "At that point, I carried you." And so this journey has a lot to do with bearing these challenges and understanding that we are never by ourselves, even if we don't have eyes to see and ears to listen. And in that way, Marluce, I think we can move on to the next piece, which are the actual Beatitudes. But it's important for us to highlight that the purpose and meaning that Jesus wants to bring is special. It's that he's asking with these Beatitudes that we get closer to the kingdom of heavens, that we understand what it is to console others, mercy, of peace, that we may find plenitude, and that we may understand that we are children of God. So we are going to dive into the Beatitudes, and here are the slides. And here's the first one. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And it's a beautiful one. The poor in spirit. And here we can think about this poverty in the terms of humility. And as we think about this relationship between the ego and the self in this process of individuation, this capacity of the ego to understand its limits, to place itself in a position that is open to life. And here I am remembered of Francis of Assisi. There is a biographer, Leonardo Boff, a Brazilian theologian. And he talks about poverty. When he talks about Francis' poverty, he says that Francis was not only materially poor, and that he wanted to give away his material goods. But another poverty is that he also wanted to give away that separated him from others. And I found beautiful this definition of poverty that he gave to Francis. So blessed are those that are able to take away that which distances us from others, that brings us in a position of humility towards life.
nosso tamanhinho ali,
and
né?
for us to have
E
to
isso
have
nos coloca, então,
consciousness
como
and
irmãos,
conscience
nos
of who we
aproximando um do
are,
outro.
and as we approach
Isso
others.
me faz lembrar das chagas da humanidade, né?
And this makes me think of the challenges we face in
feridas
society,
que
the
fazem com que a gente
self-centeredness, the
realmente
egoism,
fique
that
apartado
really
desse
make
outro,
us
que a gente não
put
vai.
some distance between us and
E isso tem
others.
muito a ver conosco,
And I think that it has a
porque
lot
ao
to
se
do with
ter cada
us.
vez mais, se trabalha pela segurança, não se
Because
teme ir ao encontro
whenever
do outro.
we work
A porta
towards
nossa não fica
improvement, we
fechada.
don't fear
Não é a porta do
others.
outro, muitas
We don't
vezes, que está
close our
fechada,
door
é a
to
nossa
others.
porta.
Oftentimes,
A
it's not
gente
other
que
people's
não está
door to them
aberta
that are
para
closed.
ir até o
Most of
outro.
the time, it's our own
Então,
door
quando
that is
você traz
closed to
isso,
others.
Marluce, de
And so when you
fato,
bring that to us, Marluce,
esse desprendimento, esse
so this
despojamento que você
detachment
trouxe, né,
that
nesse
you
dado dia,
spoke about
é um
of those who are poor in
despojamento
spirit,
também
it's also a
dessa
detachment
clausura, né,
of
dessa
this
defesa
self
grande,
closure, of
né,
this
toda essa
defensiveness,
bagagem que nós
of
trazemos
this
dentro de nós e
luggage
que
that we bring
precisamos
with
realmente
ourselves
despojar,
and that we need
nos
to detach
livrar dessa
ourselves from
bagagem,
and
né?
free
Porque não
ourselves
são
from.
só os haveres materiais que nos
Because it's
possuem,
not just
né?
physical
É a
goods that
falta
hold us
de
back.
conteúdo interno nosso,
It's the
que nós
lack of
possamos
internal
suportar
stuffing, so to speak,
todas as
for us to be able to
injustiças, né?
bear
Fazer
all
essa
these
travessia,
changes in
como nós
life,
já
to
dissemos.
go through this
Então,
journey, as
são
we
os
said.
vícios, são as
So, our
manias, são todos
vices, our
aqueles,
bad
aqueles
habits,
registros que nós trouxemos
all
do
those
passado e que
experiences that we
estamos
bring from past
atualizando agora.
lives
Tudo isso
that
precisa
we're
ser
now
passado em
updating,
Cristo,
and all
para que
this needs
nós
to be reviewed
possamos nos sentir
so that we
realmente
may
pobres
be able
em
to
espírito,
feel poor in
sentir-nos
spirit, in
abertos,
the sense of
genuínos,
open and
fraternos.
genuine and fraternal in nature as we
E
meet
aqui
Jesus.
Jesus introduz, né, esse conceito de reino dos céus,
And
né? Então,
here, Jesus
esse
also
reino dos
introduces this
céus, ele
idea
vai
of the kingdom
dizer
of
que
heaven,
está dentro de nós.
which he will then
Então,
tell us that's within
é essa
us.
busca interna mesmo
So
que
it points us
manda
to this
a
inner
gente
search
chegar nisso, né? A gente
that
chegar
asks us to
mesmo se
reach
encontrando
that
o
point of
divino que
meeting
vive em cada um
ourselves,
de
to
nós,
find the
mas
divine that
cruéfice
resides
isso
in
aí,
which one of us.
essa
And for
arrogância,
that, our
né?
ego
Da
needs to leave this
prepotência,
arrogance, this
desses valores mais transitórios,
overbearing
e precisa
pride and
realmente
transitory
se
values that
colocar
we
nessa
often
postura
espouse, and to
humilde
place
de
itself in this
transformação,
humble
né? De
position to be
aprender,
open
né?
to
De
learning,
reconhecer as
to
limitações.
recognize
Então,
our
eu acho muito
limitations.
linda essa primeira
And so I
bem-aventurança,
think it's a
né? Porque ele
beautiful
nos
way
traz,
to
então, essa
start
proposta de
with
uma
this
outra
first
realidade,
beatitude,
né? Que ele
because Jesus is
denomina reino
bringing
dos
us the
céus.
proposal of a different reality, what he calls a
Podemos passar,
kingdom of
então, para a
heaven.
segunda, Claudinha?
Should we go to the second one, Claudia?
Bem-aventurados os que
Blessed
choram,
are those who
porque
mourn,
eles serão
for they
consolados.
will be comforted.
Como é que a gente podia entender isso, Cláudia?
How could we understand that, Claudia?
Esse choro sentido que
This
todos nós
mourning
temos, é um choro que lava a alma, mas é
is
um
this
choro que
cry
vai
that we all
conectado
have
com a
that
bem-aventurança
washes over our
anterior,
souls,
que fala da
but it's also
humildade,
connected
do
to the
outro
previous
desafio.
beatitude
É um
that
choro
talks
onde se
about
reconhece a
detachment.
pequenez, a
It
nossa
is a mourning
pequenez.
where we
Então, é
recognize our
importante que nós
smallness.
reconheçamos a nossa pequenez para que nós
And it's
possamos
important
então
for us to
viver
recognize our
esse
own
Deus
smallness so that we may
maravilhoso que
find
nós
abode in that
reconhecemos e
divine
dar um
within us
lugar
that we
para
do
esse
not
Deus.
recognize,
Então,
to
quando ele
give a
diz
place
bem-aventurados
for
os
this
que
God, for this
choram,
divine.
os que
So when he
sofrem,
says, Blessed are those who
aqueles que
mourn,
não
those
têm
who suffer,
voz,
those who don't
aqueles que
have a
não são
voice,
olhados, não
those
são
who are not
vistos, não são
cared for or
reconhecidos
seen or
pelo outro e
recognized
por si
by
próprio.
others
Então,
and
a
by themselves.
importância de nós realmente
And so
extravasarmos
it
essa
highlights the
dor para que
importance
nós
of us
possamos
to
reconhecer
externalize
quem
that
somos.
pain, to
Se
recognize who we
Marluce
are.
lembrou, se Jesus apresentou
Marluce has told
um
us
pai de amor,
that
e se ele
Jesus has
apresentou
brought us a
um
father of
rei de
love.
amor,
And if he
então
also
ele veio
brought us
para
the idea of a
cuidar desse
kingdom of
pai
heaven,
interno, para que nós
it's
possamos de
impossible for us
fato
to wash
viver
our
ainda
inner
nesse
place
reino
so that we may take
maravilhoso, um reino
abode
destruidor,
in that
um
inner
reino que
kingdom that is within
reflete
us,
a
a kingdom that
pureza,
reflects the
a
purity and the
gratidão
beauty
pela vida.
and the gratitude for
Então,
life.
esse choro muitas vezes é
So this morning
acompanhado das coisas
is often
mundanas, mais uma
accompanied by
vez, né?
the
Um
day
choro
to day
onde
life
as
things.
pessoas
Sometimes we focus on what we don't have, but it's also good for us to focus on that which we have, and that's a challenge for all of us to find for that which we have, of all the journey we have already walked on, to value that experience, to congratulate ourselves on what we've accomplished, because sometimes it's often hard for us to congratulate ourselves, not in a vanity way, but in a true recognition of our efforts. And that all this has a place. There's a place for recognition for us and for this journey that we have been on. So these happinesses, so to speak, of the world must give way to this feeling of peace, of this relationship with the sacred.
Fiquei profundamente tocada, né, com essa
And I am
imagem
deeply
bíblica
touched
dos que choram,
by this image of
que eu me
that blessed are
conectei,
those who
assim,
mourn,
nós estamos
because I connected
sofrendo, né, gente?
to
Quando
the
a gente tem
idea
esse
that when we are
sentimento de
suffering,
impotência,
when we
de
have
não
the
saber o que
suffering
fazer, e aí
of
a gente
helplessness, of
chora.
not knowing what to do, and we
E
cry.
Jesus diz que a gente vai ser confortado. Então,
And Jesus says that we will be
essa
comforted.
capacidade, assim, da gente fazer contato com a nossa dor,
So it's
com as
this
nossas
ability for us to get in
limitações,
touch with our
né?
pain, with our
Entender que tem
limitations,
coisas que nós não vamos
and to
compreender no
understand
primeiro
that there are
momento,
things
mas
that we
que
may
se a
not
gente
understand in a
entrega,
first glance.
né, para essa instância maior,
But
para essa
if we
instância
surrender
superior, essa
ourselves to
instância que
this
sabe,
greater
aí vai ter um
power,
conforto.
we
Tem
will find
coisas que
comfort in it.
escapam da nossa resolução
There are
através do
things that
ego,
escape
né? E só nos
our
resta
ability to
entender que
solve
não
them
tem
through the
nada.
ego. And all
Então,
we can
é essa
do is
maturidade
surrender
de
to
compreender
them. And it's this maturity to
e essa imagem
understand
linda ali, né?
this
De
beautiful
que
image that we
ele está
have,
nos abraçando, né?
that
Dentro
Jesus
desse poema
is
que tu
comforting us,
lembraste, né, Cláudia? E que ele carrega no colo.
and that he can
Então, eu
carry
acho que
us
essa
during the difficult
imagem, assim,
moments,
do
much like the
choro,
poem that you
né?
mentioned
Ela
with the footsteps in the
ela
sand.
mostra a nossa fragilidade
So this
e,
morning,
ao
this
mesmo
crying talks
tempo,
about our frailty,
Jesus dizendo,
and
olha,
at
vocês
the
não
same
estão
time,
sozinhos, né?
Jesus and
Então,
spirituality
isso
reminding us that
muitas
we are
vezes
not
nós
alone,
esquecemos, porque
and that we
nós
often
tendemos a
forget
viver numa lógica onde o
because
ego
we
tem que
tend
decidir
to live
tudo,
in a
tem
world
que
where we
saber
think
tudo,
that the
né?
ego
Ele que
needs to
estabelece as
decide on
metas,
everything,
né?
that
E
needs
nós
to
às vezes
know everything,
esquecemos
that
de
needs to set
viver
all
a
goals,
nossa
and we
realidade
sometimes
espiritual
forget
e
our spiritual
do nosso
reality
próprio processo de individuação também.
and our very
Quantas
own
coisas que às
individuation
vezes o
process.
nosso ego quer e a
How
vida
many
nos
things
mostra
does our
tudo
ego sometimes
e a gente
want,
só vai entender
but our
isso anos
life is
depois,
led
né?
somewhere else, and we only
Então,
understand that years later,
a gente
that
pensa
that
que era um
which we
peso e
wanted
depois acaba
um,
mostrando um sentido, né?
is different, and what we
Eu
thought was
acho
a
que desse
problem
resgate
ends
dos
up
que
being a
choram também,
positive thing.
Jesus está nos dando
And
uma
so when
instância
we
maior,
sing
assim,
that
né?
the blessed are those who mourn,
Que sustenta a
Jesus
esperança
is
maior da
giving
nossa
us
vida
a
também.
perspective that there is a larger perspective at play. I'm also reminded of the word trust, as you're talking about that, Marluce, that there is a trust, that there is someone who will comfort us. And that someone that will trust us can come under different clothing. Sometimes we expect a specific way in which we will be comforted, but this presence may come and manifest in many different ways. It could be a good morning, a smile by somebody else. It is a happy meeting with somebody on the way home. So this comfort can come in many different shapes and forms. And then we moved on to the third beatitude. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Just as we look at this image, we are touched. We almost wish to be this little sheep being held by someone in a tender and caring way. Very happy, feeling very light. And in many ways, that is what we wish, to be peaceful. And how are we? How are we in our journey?
É linda essa imagem mesmo, porque a mansidão, né,
And this image
não
is really beautiful
não é a
because
gente não ter
meekness
conflitos né? Mas
it's
diante
not
do conflito, a
not
gente
having
não ser
conflicts,
tomado
but it
por esse
is
impulso de
not be taken
violência,
by
né?
this
De
impulse
reagir
of
de uma
violence
forma
and reacting
passiva.
once we are
É uma
faced with
postura
conflict.
interna,
It
né?
is an inner
Mesmo
stance
nas situações mais
that even
difíceis,
in the
a gente
most
buscar
difficult
esse lugar de
situations, we
serenidade,
can
né?
search
Então,
this
é
place
muito
that
bonita
is
essa
serene.
imagem da
So this
mansidão,
overall
né?
image
E
of
justamente
meekness
Jesus
is very
contrapõe
beautiful because
essa
Jesus
imagem que a gente
uses
tem de
that
que
as
nós
a
temos que sempre
counterpoint
reagir,
to the image that
né?
we have
Sempre na
always
luta,
we always
sempre
have to
combater,
react. We
né?
always have to
Muitas
combat
vezes
life. We always have
nós
to act on
reagimos
things.
violentamente
Many
porque
times
nos
we
sentimos
react violently
ameaçados,
because we
né?
feel
E a
threatened.
mansidão, ela propõe
But meekness,
exatamente uma
however,
postura contrária,
proposes
né? De
a different
confiança, né?
attitude,
De
one of trust,
autoconhecimento,
of
com
self
uma
discovery,
lógica maior
that
que
there is a
rege o
larger
universo. E eu
logic or
posso ficar
reason at
serena
play that
quando
governs the universe,
usar
and
os
that
recursos que eu
I
tenho,
can
né? Então,
calm
eu
myself and use
entendo
the
que a
resources that I
mansidão
have,
nesse
that I will be
sentido,
okay.
né?
So I
Alguém que se
understood
ergue,
meekness in that
capaz
sense
assim de se manter
of
calmo,
being
né? Hoje a
capable
gente tem
of
nós vivemos
remaining
um momento de
calm.
tanta ansiedade, né? E nós temos
And
planos
nowadays we live in moments of so
rituais para
much
nos acelerar,
anxiety,
né? Para
and we
chegar nessa
find
mansidão.
ourselves using
Mas
so many
o
different
que
rituals
se
to try to
nós
reach that
reagirmos de uma
meekness,
forma violenta,
because
é
every time that we
impossível.
react violently
Existe
or
uma tendência
impulsively
muito
to
grande
something,
depois de
there
nós
is a
nos
tendency
arrependermos, né?
that we may regret it.
Então, a mansidão como uma postura
So,
interna
meekness
que
as an inner
Jesus
stance
traz.
is what Jesus brings to us.
Importante que você traz, né? E o conflito ele sempre vai existir, né, gente?
And
Porque nós
conflicts
somos
will
seres
always
muito
exist
complexos.
because
Estamos
we
aqui
are very
para
complex
resolver
beings,
muitas questões.
and we're
Então,
here
o
to
conflito faz parte da nossa
deal
vida,
with
né?
a
Conflito é
lot
a
of
dúvida,
conflicts.
é isto ou isto.
Conflict is the doubt.
São
Is that,
aquelas
should I do this?
confusões
Should I do
nossas
that?
que nós
Those
atravessamos.
moments
Então, o
of
conflito
confusion
faz
and
parte.
doubt. So conflicts are part
Sabemos que
of
essa
life.
vida não é uma vida de passeios,
And we know
uma
that
vida de
we haven't come
diversão.
to
É
this
uma vida de
life to just enjoy and
resoluções,
have
né? De
fun.
resolver
It's
situações,
about
problemas
resolution,
que nós
about
mesmos
solving
criamos
challenges that
em
we have
nossa
created
vida.
for ourselves in
Então,
the
os conflitos,
previous
eles vão fazer parte
life.
da vida.
And
O
so
que
conflicts are part of life
precisamos é ter essa calma, essa
because we
serenidade, para nós
need to have this
atravessarmos
calm,
aquele
this
momento de
serenity to be able
tempestade,
to
aquele momento
traverse the
tumultuado,
storm,
aquele momento
the moment of
onde muitas vezes
challenges,
nós achamos que não
those
vamos dar
moments
conta,
in
muitas
which
vezes
many
nós
times we
nos
think we
entregamos a
cannot
uma
handle.
profunda tristeza, né?
And we end up
Então,
surrendering ourselves to like a
essa
sadness.
calmaria interna é algo que
So, this
precisamos
inner
nos
calm,
trabalhar, né?
it's something that we
E
need
o
to work
manso,
on quite a
ele
bit.
faz uma oposição grande com o
And the meek
violento, porque o
give us a
violento,
great
ele se
opposition to
mostra muitas
violence
vezes a
because those who are
fragilidade.
violent or
Aquele que
violence
grita,
itself
ele grita porque ele
shows its
acha que ele
frailty.
só vai
Those who yell,
ser
they only
respeitado
yell
pelo
because
grito.
they only
E
think
nós
they will
vamos
be respected
entendendo
through the
como
yelling.
Jesus, com a sua autoridade, com a
And
sua
we'll begin to
paciência,
understand how
ele
Jesus,
chegava e
with
se
all his
colocava.
authority, all
Né?
his meekness,
Então,
he
nós
was able
vemos
to
muitas
make
vezes
his
nós
presence felt.
pensamos, Jesus, a gente sabe
So
aquele
often
episódio, né, dos
we
mercadores
think
no
about
templo
things.
e ele fica
For instance, there's
nervoso,
an
né?
episode of the
Mas ele
merchants
está
in the
mostrando
temple in which
ali uma
Jesus is
forma
furious, but
educativa.
he is showing
Ele não
us
está
in an
mostrando ali
educative
que ele não
way.
é manso. Ele está mostrando uma
He's not showing us
serenidade,
that he's not
uma
meek. No,
forma
he
correta
is
de ser. E
showing us
muitas
a
vezes
correct
a gente
way of
as
seeing.
pessoas confundem uma forma
And
mais
sometimes people
séria de se
confuse a more
colocar com uma
serious way
forma
of
agressiva.
communicating or
E não
manifesting ourselves
necessariamente
as an
estamos
aggression.
agressivos.
And that is not
A
always the
seriedade
case.
faz parte.
Being
Nós
serious
precisamos ser sérios
is
aqui
part
no
of
ser,
life. We
mas
need to
isso
be
não
serious.
significa que seriedade seja
But that
estar
does not
carrancudo.
mean that
Não,
being
não é
serious is
isso.
to be grumpy,
É mostrar uma seriedade, né?
is to
Mostrar como
show
você se
seriousness,
apresenta diante da
is to
vida.
present
E
oneself
essa é
towards
manso
life in a serious way.
de
And
Jesus,
this
que Jesus
meekness
nos
that
fala,
Jesus
ela
talks to us
faz
about,
oposição com essa violência,
it,
com
it
essa
gives us great
agressividade
opposition to
tão
that aggression, that
comum.
violence that is so
Nós
prevalent in
vemos
today's
quantas
world.
pessoas estão
And we can see how many people feel out of control, disorganized, and with so much violence and aggression in their hearts. Oftentimes, we don't even have dialogues anymore. And so Jesus reminds us of that meekness that goes in an opposite direction of that cholera, of that anger, and that makes us suffer by releasing all this adrenaline in our body, which only makes us suffer.
Você quer falar mais alguma coisa, Marluce?
Não, eu acho que nós podemos ir para outra.
And I think that we can go to the next one, Claudia.
Isso.
Yes.
Bem-aventurados os
Blessed
que
are
têm
those
fome e sede de
who
justiça,
hunger and thirst for
porque eles
righteousness,
serão
for they will
fartos.
be filled.
Como é que a gente podia pensar isso?
How could we think about
Fome e
this, Claudia?
sede de justiça.
Hunger and thirst for
Pensando
righteousness and
nessa,
justice.
quando Jesus usa esse termo justiça, né?
When
Esse
Jesus
arquétipo de Deus que
uses
vai
this
reger o
idea
universo,
of
tem
righteousness,
uma
this
lógica, existe a
archetype
justiça
that there is
dos
something that
homens,
governs
né?
the
Existe
universe,
uma
that there is a
justiça
justice of
maior,
men, but there is a higher
às vezes nos
justice
custa compreender.
that sometimes it's
E aí,
hard for us to
fiquei
comprehend.
pensando nesses que quem tem fome e sede de justiça, essas no
So I was
sentido
thinking
de
that
que
those who
essa
thirst
nossa
and are
sede,
hunger
esse
for
nosso
righteousness, that
desejo
this
de uma
thirst, this
compreensão
desire
maior, né, de
for
uma compreensão
greater
maior da
comprehension
vida, do que rege
of
as
life
coisas.
or what
Muitas
governs
vezes
things.
aqui nós podemos nos sentir
Many times we feel
injustiçados a partir
injustice.
de uma lógica, né, de uma
We
lógica
feel that we
mais
have suffered
limitada
injustices
aqui dessa
because of a
encarnação,
logic that is more rooted in this
desse ego, desse
incarnation and
contexto
this ego, in
aqui.
this
Mas
context
se a
that we
gente
are living
pensar na
in.
justiça como uma lei de
But
Deus
if
que
we
rege,
think about
então
justice
o
as a
nosso
law
olhar se
of God
amplia.
that governs the
Então,
universe, our understanding broadens.
essa sede de justiça,
This
esse
thirst for
profundo
righteousness
desejo de compreender
and this
essa
deep
realidade
desire
maior,
to
né,
comprehend this greater
é que
reality, this
sustenta
divine reality that supports and empowers the whole
Lembra também da
universe.
verdade. Justiça como uma verdade.
And
Uma
it
verdade
also reminds me
instalada,
of the truth,
instaurada dentro
a
de
truth
nós.
that is
De entender
installed
que
within
nada
us
nós sabemos e
so that we can
ouvimos muito,
understand
nada é por
that
acaso.
nothing is
Mas muitas
happens by
vezes
chance.
a pessoa se sente injustiçada,
But many times we find ourselves
equivocada
as
no
the receivers
sentido
of an
do que é
injustice.
a
That is
justiça.
because we are
A justiça
disconnected from the true meaning of what justice and righteousness are.
né? A justiça
Justice is a rescue, is a
justiça
meeting, a
tornar-se
rendezvous,
uno, né? Então,
is to
essa
feel
sede de
oneself whole.
justiça é
So
a
this
sede de
thirst for
encontrar também
justice
essa
is a
verdade.
thirst
Eu
for
sou o
meeting
caminho, a verdade e a
justice.
vida.
As Jesus says, I am the way, the
Precisam
truth, and the
encontrar
life.
essa verdade.
So it's the
E
desire to
hoje eu
meet
fico
this truth.
pensando quanto as pessoas
And
estão
today I
fartas,
think about
quanto elas
how
estão fartas do que o
people
mundo
are
oferece.
feeling full,
Elas estão
full of what the world
atravessando
is
até
offering.
situações difíceis de
And in many
saúde, né?
instances, they
Por
even
conta de
go
uma
through many
fartura gigante de
difficult health
alimentos, muitas vezes,
issues
e
because
coisas
they have so much
que não
food,
nutrem,
of food
mas
that
que enchem,
do not
não
nourish
dão
us.
sustento.
They just makes us
Então,
feel full.
essa sede e fome, que
So
não
this
é
thirst and
apagada
hunger
nem pelo
that cannot be
mundo
satiated
material,
by the material
pelos
world,
prazeres, e nem
by the
pela
pleasures of the physical
nutrição
body,
do
or
alimento
by the insufficient
desmesurado.
food
Então, há uma
out of
fome e
control
uma
in our world.
sede. Há
So
um
there is a hunger and
vazio
there's
que
a
precisa ser
thirst.
preenchido.
There's an emptiness that needs to be filled.
Muito bonito isso, né, Cláudio?
And it's very beautiful, right, Claudia?
Também me lembrou, quando tu falaste da verdade, né?
It
Os
also
espíritos dizem,
helped me
né,
recall
no
that when
livro
you're
dos
talking about
espíritos,
truth,
né?
that the
Onde
spirits
estão
tells
as
us in the
leis de
Spirit's
Deus?
book,
Estão na
they ask us, where
consciência,
are the
né?
laws
Que
of God
consciência
inscribed?
é essa
And they
consciência do
reply
céu,
that it
do
is in our
espírito.
consciousness
Então,
that
essa
these laws are
fome e
written in.
sede,
Which
né, de
consciousness? The self.
justiça, de
This
verdade,
hunger and
né,
thirst for
também
justice and
é
truth.
uma busca de conexão com esse
It's
aspecto
also a search for
sagrado da justiça.
connection with the sacred in our
Dos
existence.
aspectos da individuação
And
é
one
a
of the
gente
aspects of
encontrar a
individuation
sacralidade da vida,
is
né?
to
O
find
aspecto
this
sagrado da
sacredness of
existência.
life. of
né?
our
Onde cada um de
existence,
nós tem lugarzinho
where
aqui no universo,
each
né?
one of us has a place in the
Então,
universe, in the collective.
seria realmente a gente ter esse desejo profundo do ser humano, né?
So, really, it's about this
De se
profound
encontrar com o
desire from
divino
human
mesmo, né?
beings
Que a
to
nossa
meet
trajetória é essa, né?
the
A gente
divine, and
sai
that's our
inconsciente de Deus
destiny.
e
We
volta para
leave
Ele.
God unconsciously and we return to God in a very conscious way.
E aí nós entramos numa próxima,
And then we move to
bem-aventurados os
our next
misericordiosos,
beatitude.
porque eles
Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy.
muito linda, né?
And that image is also a very beautiful one
Torna ele saudável.
of a paralytic that is healed by
É
Jesus.
linda essa imagem, né? E a gente associa muitas
It's a very
vezes
beautiful
a
image.
misericórdia a um
And we
atributo
associate
divino,
mercy
né?
as a divine
Porque eu fico
attribute.
pensando, tem um filósofo da atualidade
And I think quite a
que é
bit
o
about it. There's a
Sponville, que ele
contemporary
fala da
philosopher, Esponville,
misericórdia
that talks
como
about
algo assim
mercy
que está acima, ele fala de situações tão
as
difíceis
something
muitas vezes de serem
of situations
compreendidas
that
e
are sometimes so
perdoadas,
hard
né?
to be
Que
understood
precisam
and
da
forgiven
misericórdia,
that
né?
require
Então,
mercy.
é esse atributo do coração, né?
And it is
Essa lógica
this attribute of the
completamente
heart,
amorosa,
of this very
né? Que não
loving
é intelectual,
reasoning that is
né?
not
E
often
essa
intellectual,
capacidade assim
and this
de
ability
profunda compreensão da
of deep
realidade humana, né?
comprehension of human
Enquanto todos
reality,
nós estamos conectados nas nossas
and how
dificuldades,
all of us
nas
are connected
nossas
to our
dores, né?
challenges,
Por
of
isso
our
que eu acho que a
pains.
misericórdia ela é um
And
atributo
that's why I
bastante
think that mercy
profundo e
is a
talvez
very deep
difícil, né, da gente
concept
compreender
and
muitas
perhaps
vezes, né?
hard for us to understand at times,
Porque ela implica em renunciar ao ódio, renunciar
because he
à
has a lot to do
violência,
about
né? Renunciar
renouncing
a tudo,
hatred,
né? Nessa compreensão
anger,
maior das
violence,
coisas,
and go towards
Sim,
this
Marluce,
larger
desculpa
comprehension of
te
life.
interromper no final.
né?
And Marluce, sorry
Eu
for
fico pensando
interrupting
que a
you. And I
misericórdia,
also
ela
think
é
that
tanto
mercy
nossa para o nosso próximo,
is so much
quanto
ours
de
towards
Deus para
others,
nós.
but
Então, são
also
Uhum.
God's towards
estágios
us.
muito distantes de misericórdia.
And so we have
Nós
very different
precisamos
phases of
exercer
mercy,
o
but that we need to
exercício de
exercise, we need to
Deus. A gente
practice
precisa, o exercício, o
that,
hábito. Então, nós precisamos
right?
exercer,
So we need to
sermos
exercise being
misericordiosos,
merciful,
poder oferecer, poder
to be
dar,
able to offer, to
sem
give
aguardar
that
nada
to
em
others
troca.
without
Sabe,
expecting
vigiar, ser
anything in return.
misericordioso, não julgar. Nós temos o mau
To be
hábito
merciful,
de
to
julgar,
not judge. We have a horrible
de
habit of
olhar
judging
para o
others,
outro sobre a nossa
to
ótica.
look at others
Não é a
with
nossa
our
ótica que
perspective.
vai dizer
It
o
is
que o
not
outro
our
passa,
perspective
é
that
o
will
coração
dictate what
dele
others go
que
through.
vai
It is their
dizer,
heart
é
that
aquilo que
will
habita
guide
nele.
them.
Então
It
nós
is
temos
that
o mau
which
hábito.
inhabit in them.
Então, o
And so we have the
misericordioso,
habit of judging
ele
others, but the
compadece,
merciful
né? Ele
does
abre a
not
porta,
judge.
como
It is
Marluce vai dizer, a
compassionate
porta do
towards
seu
others.
coração e
They
abrir a
open the
outra
hearts of their
para
hearts
outros
to
precisam.
welcome
E a
others who may need
misericórdia, a
it.
misericórdia de Deus é algo
And
assim
divine
que
mercy,
encanta. E muitas
it's something
vezes a
that
pessoa diz misericórdia,
fascinates me
Senhor, quando há algo
because people say,
muito
Mercy, Lord,
dramático e difícil
when there's
para
something
resolver.
so
E aí, às
difficult that they are
vezes,
going
a
through.
pessoa pode pedir quando há um
Many
ente
times people
doente,
may
alguém
ask for a loved
e
one
pede misericórdia, né?
who
E
is
a
hurt or who is
divina
gravely ill and they
providência
ask for
leva aí
mercy.
um
And
favorecimento,
divine
uma
mercy
cura,
can
um
help with
apaziguamento da
the
vida,
healing
ou até mesmo no descanso.
or even in the
A
rest.
misericórdia de Deus,
Because
ela é
mercy, a
infinita.
divine
Ele
mercy,
sabe
is
daquilo que o
infinite.
nosso coração
And
pede.
God
Então, o
knows
ato
what
de
our
pedir
heart demands.
misericórdia
So
não é muitas
the action
vezes
of
não é
asking for
dizer para ele o
mercy
que nós queremos
is not to
expressar,
tell God
é
what we
simplesmente
want,
a
because God
conexão
knows.
com o
It's
divino.
simply the
É
connection with the
conectar. E aí, mais
divine.
uma vez, a gente fala da conexão
And
com o
one more,
divino.
we talk about connection with
Conectar
the
com o
divine.
divino para ele, e de
To connect
fato
with the
nós vamos
divine
até ele. Quando nós
and to
entregamos o nosso
really leads
coração e
us to God
depositamos
when we surrender
nele
our
essa
God, our
dúvida,
heart
essa
to
solicitação de
Him.
misericórdia,
And when we ask for
isso
this
já é
desire
uma sensação
to
de
have mercy,
bem-estar muito muito grande.
we can already feel wellness.
Nós não podemos.
We ask somebody who can
renunciar,
better
né?
than us.
Cláudia, misericórdia implica em renunciar à vingança,
And mercy
renunciar ao ódio,
implies in renunciation,
e
of letting go
transformar. Eu me
of
lembrei,
revenge,
estava
of
falando,
hatred, and transformation. And
do
as you were
relato de quando
speaking,
Jesus
I recall
vai
that
resgatar
story
Judas.
of when
Quando
Judas goes to
se
rescue
suicida,
Judas
né? Jesus
after he commits
vai e
suicide.
resgata ele, né?
And Jesus goes and
Jesus,
rescues him.
naquele momento, não só
And
mostra
in that
o
moment,
profundo
shows
amor que ele
us
tinha por Judas,
not only a deep love that he had
mas
for
também esse
Judas,
ato de misericórdia.
but also this act of
Então,
mercy.
E isso transformou, foi fundamental, né? Então,
And that was a
muitas
fundamental
vezes
piece
nós
of that experience.
vemos cenas, né?
So many times we
Escutamos
see
coisas
or
e a nossa
hear
tendência natural é
scenes, and our
reagir
natural
querendo
tendency
vingança,
is to
querendo
react
retribuir
demanding
aquele olho por olho, né, de
retribution, an eye
vingança,
for an
que
eye,
ainda está muito
a tooth
presente
for
no
a
nosso
tooth,
inconsciente coletivo.
that is still very
E
present
aí
in our
Jesus vai
collective
dizer que são
unconscious.
bem-aventurados os misericordiosos.
But instead,
Então,
Jesus says that
propondo uma
blessed are
lógica
those who are
muito
merciful.
diferente do que
And he brings forth
nós
a way of acting, a
observamos.
logic that is very different from the ones that we are immersed in.
E aí entramos na próxima bem-aventurança.
And thus we go on to the next one.
Coração.
Blessed are the pure in heart, for
E
they will see
sempre quando
God.
nós falamos dessa bem-aventurança, nós
And whenever we talk about this
imediatamente nos
particular
remetemos à
beatitude,
imagem da criança,
we think about children.
não é, Marluce?
Isn't
A
that so,
imagem da
Marluce?
criança
And the image
como
of
esse
children
olhar, né, sem
with that
preconceito,
eye
né, de uma total
of
abertura,
a total
de
openness,
uma abertura para a vida,
of openness
né, que
towards life,
propõe estar assim despojado de
that
defesas, né,
proposes
porque
to
no mundo da
be
criança
devoid
tudo é
of
possível.
defense
Isso
mechanisms.
que é
Because in the
interessante.
world of
Se a
children,
gente
everything
der
is
um
possible.
brinquedinho para
If
duas
we
crianças,
give
elas criam um
a
universo
toy
inteiro.
for two children, they will
O
create
mundo
a whole
infantil
universe out of it.
não tem
The
separação,
world of a
tudo é
child
possibilidade.
doesn't have
Então,
separations,
nós vamos
everything is
perdendo,
possibilities.
né, quando a gente
And with
vai
time, as we grow, sometimes we lose that
amadurecendo e nós
as
vamos
we mature.
recebendo, então, todos esses estímulos do nosso, não só do nosso ambiente
And as we
familiar, como,
receive all the
né, da
stimuli
própria
from
vida,
our
da própria
homes, of
sociedade,
life, or
nós
society,
muitas vezes vamos
we often
endurecendo, né, o nosso coração.
become
Nós
hardened in our
vamos nos
hearts.
tornando muito defensivos em
We become more
relação às
defensive
pessoas, à
towards
vida,
people,
muitas
towards
vezes
life,
defensivos em relação até
and
à
sometimes
divindade,
even
né? Então,
defensive towards the
uma
sacred
pureza de
divinity.
coração, eu acho que a gente pode pensar como
So the pure in heart, we
essa
can
abertura
here
mesmo,
we can
né, ao
think
que
about
vem do
this
divino,
openness
né,
of
quando
that which
nós
comes from the
despojamos
divine
os nossos preconceitos, né,
when we are able to let go of
E
our
aí me lembra da
prejudices.
palavra desapego.
Again, and I am
Quando você diz
reminded
nós
of the
vamos
word
endurecendo os corações, eu fico
detachment.
pensando,
And
nós
as you're
vamos
saying,
entulhando o
yes,
coração de
you
coisas que não
said
fazem
as we harden our
sentido.
heart, we start
E
to
vamos entulhando
gather these
coisas,
things in our
assim,
hearts
de
that don't make
mágoas,
sense.
de
And we
mágoas, e
fill
aquilo
our
é
hearts
mágoa, é
with
uma mágoa
hurts,
parada, numa
with
emoção que
pains,
cada vez que nós lembramos
and
dela, nós
emotions that
cristalizamos
when
isso.
we recall them, we
Então,
crystallize
como
that
nós
negative
vamos
feeling.
entulhando nossos corações,
And how do
os
we
nossos
crowd our
interiores?
hearts,
Então, é
our
importante que
inner
a gente se
world with these
desapegue
experiences? So it's important
disso,
for us to
né? De tudo
detach
que não
ourselves
tem valor,
from
de tudo
all of
que
that,
não
from that which is
importa.
not
Porque quando
really
nós
worthwhile,
atravessamos
that does not
uma
matter.
passagem difícil, nós vamos
Because when we
entendendo o que
go through a
realmente
difficult
importa
time,
na vida.
we will really be able to
Uma
understand what
passagem
really
muito
matters and
difícil.
that which
Então, nós
does
vamos
not
nos
make any
desapegando de tudo
difference.
isso e vamos tornando,
So
então,
to
essa
detach
nossa
oneself
água,
from
que
all of
é
this, and
uma
we will
água mais
transform these
cristalina,
negative
uma água
experiences
que
into
possa
something
refletir,
pure,
então,
something
Deus,
that can
que
reflect
habita em
God,
nós. Que bonito
that
quando a gente
inhabits
puder
us.
chegar
How
nesse
wonderful
ponto, né?
it is
E
for us
nós
to
já
be able to
visitamos em
reach that
alguns
point.
momentos, quando a gente se aproxima
And
de
in many
alguém,
times we get
né?
near
E a
it
gente pode, então,
when we
fazer
get close to
refletir esse
someone
Deus, e a
and we
pessoa
can
sentir um bem-estar,
have
assim
God
como nós nos
reflected and help
relacionamos
the other
também
person
sentirmos da
feel
mesma
better.
forma.
Much the
Então,
same way
tornar
that
essa
sometimes we
água
approach
nossa
others
mais
and they help us
agitada,
feel
mais
well.
pura, para que a gente
So it's to
possa, enfim,
change
refletir
that
esse Deus
stuffing within
maravilhoso.
us and make it pure so that we can then
Jesus, em
become
outros
better.
momentos, usa a imagem da criança também.
And in many different moments, Jesus also
Então,
uses
o
the image of
resgate
children. So
isso
is this rescuing
que nós fomos perdendo mesmo, né?
of
E
that
de
which we
amanhã
have
vai se
slowly
conectando,
lost over
a gente
time as the
vai
world
sendo
gets
guiado muitas
more
vezes
complex, and
por
sometimes we're
medo,
guided by our
a gente
fear
vai se
and
relacionando com
determine how we relate
e
to
a criança
life in
ela
general.
resgata então
And
esse
the
estado
child
assim,
then
de
rescues
abertura, de
this
disponibilidade,
state
né?
of
E eu me
openness,
lembrei
of
que na
possibilities.
mitologia grega
And I'm
existia um
reminded of
deus
Greek
que se chama
mythology
Asclépio,
where
que
there is a
é
god called
relacionado ao
Asclepius,
deus da cura, né?
which is
E
connected
no templo
to
de Asclépio, ele
healing.
tinha uma
And the temple of
inscrição na
Asclepius,
entrada do templo de
there was a
Asclépio que
writing in
dizia,
his
né, que
temple
para entrar lá
that used to say
exigia-se um
that for you
coração
to
puro.
enter, you had to
Eu achei
have
muito
open
interessante
heart,
esse
a pure
processo de
heart.
cura que
And I thought
Asclépio
that was very
propõe,
interesting that the
né?
process
Então,
of
cura
healing
para
that
ele
Asclepius
envolvia o
suggests,
corpo e a
that
mente.
healing
Então,
involves the mind and the
no templo de
body,
Asclépio, ele
and that
tem
it
vários
requires an
templos,
open heart.
mas no maior templo dele,
But
lá
in
em
his
Mileto,
greatest
na
temple
Grécia,
in Greece,
ele tinha assim, as pessoas iam, elas recebiam os
people
chás, né, as
would and
ervas,
take
elas
teas and
elas iam no
herbs.
ginásio para fazer exercícios, tinha
They would
biblioteca para
exercise. They had a
leitura e tinha um
library for
lugar onde elas
reading,
iam dormir,
but there also
né,
had a
para
place for them to
incubar os
rest,
sonhos, né?
to
Então,
incubate dreams.
para passar por tudo isso, ele
And to
propõe
go
então a
through all of
pureza,
this, he
né, de
proposes this
dizer se
purity in heart,
despojar,
to
né, e estar
detach
entregue,
ourselves
né?
and to
Então essa
surrender to the
disponibilidade,
healing,
né, que a
this, to
pureza
be
nesse
open and
sentido,
available
não no
to this
sentido
purity,
pejorativo, que muitas vezes
not
a
in a
gente tem,
negative
né,
way
uma
that sometimes
ingenuidade assim,
we think, like in an
você foi muito
ingenious way.
ingênuo e foi
Oh, you're
enganado, não é
very
nesse sentido,
naive
né?
and were
É de abertura.
misled. No, not in that sense, but just being open.
E aí, então, nós podemos passar para a próxima, Lana.
And then we can move on to the next
Que é
beatitude,
bem-aventurados
which
os
is the one, blessed are the
pacificadores,
peacemakers,
porque
for
eles serão
they
chamados filhos
will
de
be
Deus.
called children of
Então,
God.
depois do coração puro,
So
cada vez
after
mais cristalino,
a pure
menos
heart,
contaminado, né?
a less
Nós
contaminated
podemos, então,
heart,
visitar esse lugar de
then we
pacificadores
can
e sermos chamados
go to
filhos
this
de
place where we
Deus.
can become
Aí eu trago aqui
peacemakers, to
três
become children of
frases para a
God.
gente
And I bring here three sentences
considerar.
for us to
Paz na
reflect
terra
on.
aos homens de boa vontade.
Goodwill on earth
Eu
amongst
vos dou
people, men of
paz,
goodwill.
eu vos deixo a
I
minha
have
paz.
give you peace and I
E Salem Aleichem,
give you my peace.
que é a
And
paz
Salam
seja
Malek,
convosco.
which is,
Então,
may peace be
visitar
with you.
esses lugares de paz que
So
precisamos
to visit
muito.
these places of
A
peace
principal
is
tarefa
very
do homem é
important.
fazer morada
Our
no
greatest
Deus
purpose
dentro de
is
nós.
to
E
create
para
this
isso ele
shelter for
precisa
God within
estabelecer a
us.
paz
And
em
for that,
nós.
we need to
Sem
establish
guerra,
peace within
nós não
us.
conseguimos esse coração translúcido,
If we
esse
maintain a
estado de
sense of war
pacificação,
within us, we will not be
serenidade.
able to
Quem tem
reach this
paz e sossego,
peacemaking
como diz
moment.
Marluce, não teme, se
And if
entrega,
we
confia,
are peaceful,
persevera.
we don't fear,
Ele
we surrender.
não provoca paz, ele provoca o diálogo
And
tão em falta
it goes
na
towards
vida de nós,
dialogue,
hoje o mundo com bastante
a dialogue that is
guerra,
so
né?
needed and missing from this world.
Essa paz que nós buscamos, né? Que não
So
vem
this
assim
peace is the
fácil,
peace that
né?
we are searching for. It
Muitas
doesn't
vezes
come
ela
easily,
vem após um momento de
and many
muita
times
turbulência,
it comes
muita
after moments of great
tempestade,
turbulence,
muito
of
conflito,
tempest, of
muita dor,
storming,
né?
of
E
pain,
aí
of
sim,
suffering.
quando nós vivenciamos tudo aquilo e
And
entregamos,
when we live through
abrimos
all this and
muito melhor esse
surrender,
lugar de paz.
we then open this
Conhecemos a
peace
paz
place
em
within us,
Deus.
and it can experience that within
E
us.
aqui, né, Cláudia, me chama a atenção que Jesus diz: bem-aventurados os pacificadores.
And here I find very interesting
Então,
that Jesus says the
antes
blessed
ele
are the
diz:
peacemakers.
bem-aventurados os mansos.
Before he
Né?
says,
Então,
blessed are the
a
meek.
mansuetude como uma
So
condição
meekness
interna
is
nossa.
an important and
Mas
internal
aqui eu já
condition.
começo a
But here
pensar, Cláudia,
I start
na
to think,
nossa
Claudia,
missão no mundo.
about our
Nós
role
indo
in
para
the
o
world,
coletivo, nós indo
our
para o mundo.
our
Né?
individual
Então,
mission towards
nós
the
como
collective, towards the
instrumentos
world,
da paz.
us as
Né?
instruments of
E o próprio
peace,
processo de individuação,
that the
ele vai
process of
trazer isso, né? À
individuation
medida que eu
will
vou
bring to us,
encontrando o meu
to the
caminho,
extent
que eu
that
vou
I find
descobrindo
my
o
way,
meu
that I
lugar no mundo, o
discover
tempo
who I
todo ele me
am,
chama.
and find my place in the world, we start to develop this capacity to be instruments of mitigating conflicts, having this ability to not react when faced with a violent moment. And so I think that the Beatitudes that come before this are preparations for us to become peacemakers, for us to be able to be those people that in the moments of deep conflict, we can be the mediators with the people who can listen, who can be peacemakers. So it's this capacity to be able to handle that which is different. It's not running away from it, but to have this ability to navigate things, of not wanting to impose ourselves. And that's why peace is this process of building that has a lot to do with our psychological maturity. A mature ego doesn't have the need to impose itself onto others. And here we go into that logic that we talked about so often, because that young understands this counterbalance between power and love. The peacemakers will work towards love. That love connects. That love is able to build and to arrive at a summary, an understanding that sometimes our intellect cannot. So the peacemakers, they work with the logic of the heart. The differences between us do not matter. It's possible for us to find common ground, a way forward. That's why I think that this beatitude speaks about a psychological maturity that we begin to acquire the more we are connected to the divine.
Sim, uma palavra que me ocorreu foi também o silêncio, o silenciar.
And one word that came to me, Marluce, was also silence. To promote peace oftentimes is to make silence. And to make silence is not to be submissive. It is sometimes not to set things on fire. In some situations, there is not a possibility of doing something else, and silence is important. Because any word that is uttered in some situations may not be understood well. And here we go to one more. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Here, when it comes to individuation, we are connecting with this greater sense of self. And in that way, I'm able to bear the challenges. Viktor Frankl used to say that human beings cannot bear life without meaning. We are able to bear persecution in a symbolic way if we are connected with this greater sense of our existence. And it's also our ability for us to deal with contradictions, with the shadow, with criticism. We will not be fully understood by everyone. We will not be unanimously loved. And we shouldn't forget that. And this kingdom of heaven that is within us. So this process of individuation help us understand this sense of solitude, because there is a separation, a distancing from other people or from that crowd that thinks the same way, that behaves in automatic ways, that acts in robotic ways, that seeks for pleasures that no longer make sense to us, who just going through life, the more that we bring these reflections to us, this process of individuation that we spoke to in the beginning, and the Beatitudes, it leads us to a deeper process of individuation. The more we approach that and go deeper into it, we understand that those who persecute us, persecutors between quotes, they are trailing their own journey and we do ours. We cannot please everybody, and sometimes we don't even please ourselves because we have so many complexes and different personalities within us. How could we then please others? So this beatitude speaks a lot about this lonely process that we go through, but that we go through for all this knowledge, the depth, and searching for righteousness. And I remember of that wonderful passage that Jesus says that his yoke is light, is the burden soft. Those who don't make choices are lost. But when we make choices, we strengthen ourselves and continue to follow the ways. It's important for us to understand this price of choice and pay for it. And I think that we can go to the next one and last one.
Das últimas, né?
And here's the ending. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Very profound, isn't it? Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you. And I think, Claudia, this has a lot to do with some of that which you spoke about before. That we have to pay the price for our choices. That when we begin to find our way, we know that there is a price. Everything has a price in life. And I remember that Young, at the end of his life, in a very beautiful moment, he says, in a book called Memories, Reflections, and Dreams, he says, I did everything I could. If I didn't do more, it's because I couldn't. I don't exactly remember his words, but the concept stayed. He paid the price. When we talk about his journey, he was loyal to his path, that which had to do with his daemon. And he lived that in a very correct way within that which was possible to him. So when we arrive at this moment where we must bear our own testimony, give our own testimony, it's important for us to understand that we may not be understood by those around us. They might not comprehend the route or the paths that our soul chooses, but we need to be a bit loyal to our purpose here.
Exatamente. Aqui ele fala muito do suportar, né? Quando
Yep.
falarem
And here
mal
he
contra
talks a
vós
little
por minha
about the
causa.
bearing, right? When
Ele fala
people
realmente desse
falsely say all
testemunho que
kinds
nós
of evil
precisamos
against you,
dar.
of bearing the
Eu lembro
testimony.
sempre, gente, quando eu
And
lembro
I'm
do
always
testemunho, eu me lembro sempre de
reminded
quantas pessoas foram queimadas em
of
fogo,
how many people were
quantos
burned
foram
at the stake,
mortos
how
a
many were
princípios
killed
terríveis,
in these
quantos já
horrible
passaram por
moments of the
tantas
Roman circus
situações
in the beginning, and
terríveis,
how many
perseguições, e eu
have
fico
gone through
pensando,
so
nossa,
many
como deve ser
persecutions. And I
perigoso,
think,
né?
wow, things are a lot
A
easier
gente ver
nowadays,
todos
isn't
esses
it?
animais que nos
We don't
perseguem
face
e eles
all
nos
these
queimam.
animals
Então,
that eat us
vamos dar esse
or
testemunho
bonfires
todos
that
os
burn us.
dias
So
nas
let
nossas
us give our
vidas.
testimony
Cada vez
in
que
our
nós
lives.
pudermos nos modificar,
Whenever
nos
we
transformar,
can to
nós
change and
vamos
transform
fazendo
ourselves,
a vida de
let's
Jesus
make
sobre
it
nós, a sua
worthwhile to
glória,
follow
e
Jesus,
isso
to
nos
honor his life
passou.
amongst us and all
E
the
aí eu
teachings he has
lembrei que no
left us with.
final, né, nós trouxemos a oração
And
do
I'm
Paulo,
recalled
né,
that we also brought the prayer of good humor. And we are now facing a moment where the Pope Francis I has just discarnated, and he used to say that every morning he would pray this prayer. And this prayer brings us many different things. It also touches a lot of different things. And I wanted to bring the last part of that. It says, give me, Lord, a good sense of humor. Give me the grace to understand jokes so that I may know a little joy in life and communicate it and can communicate it to others. Amen. So Francis asks for a good humor, for happiness may inhabit him, so that he may be able to pass that on to others. And happiness is a gift that we can try to pass on to others. It's also a divine attribute that we can leverage to make life have meaning. It sets us in motion and it helps us tackle difficult situations and help and soften difficult situations in ourselves. And it's to be able to laugh and make fun of ourselves. And it's good to take us outside from those difficult situations that we may face. And I think that has a lot to do with lightness too. My burden is light. That's what Jesus said. So how often is our life so heavy because of a perspective that our ego brings us, for this lack of trust on the idea that there is a law that governs the entire universe, and that law is one of love, one that is connective of people, and has this eye of a child. And if we have the right environment, they have this natural happiness, the natural lightness about them. And I think that's it. I think these are the reflections that we bring today.
Então, obrigado, Marluce, obrigado, Claudia.
So thank you, Marluce, and thank you,
A gente não vai
Claudia.
fazer as perguntas e respostas por causa do tempo.
We won't do
Então, eu gostaria de perguntar
questions
a
and answers
vocês se
because of
vocês
our
têm
time,
alguma
but I
consideração
wanted
final
to
que
ask
vocês
you if there are
gostariam
any
de gostaria
final
de
comments or remarks that you'd
estar
like
fechando o
to
estudo.
share with the group before we close our evening.
Olha, eu, como consideração final, eu acho que eu deixaria
As a
assim,
final
que
consideration,
eu acho que eu sou péssima para lembrar as fontes, mas eu
I
acho que
don't
foi
remember
o
sources
Dalai
very
Lama
well,
que falou,
but I think it was
se
Dalai
tivéssemos
Lama who
salvado,
said
discurso,
that if
livro,
he had to
salvaria as
save
bem-aventuranças de Jesus,
one book,
que
one
nós
part of the
saberíamos,
gospel,
ali estariam todos os
it
ensinamentos
was the
que nós precisamos
Beatitudes.
para a nossa vida. Então,
That it
que
will
a
be all
gente
the
possa
teachings
se
that we needed for our
aproximar
life.
desse psicólogo Jesus.
So may we
Com o
approach this
coração, e
great
quando
psychologist
deixar, né, nos imaginarmos assim, nessa imagem que a Cláudia trouxe de Jesus sentado
and
no monte,
imagine this
nós,
image
como
that Claudia brought
crianças
to
em
us, that
volta, né, sendo
Jesus sitting in this mount and us as
abençoados por Deus,
children
né? Então,
just
eu
being
acho que é
bathed by
um
these
manancial
words.
imenso, assim, de
And this is a
sabedoria para
great
nós, e que aos
source of
poucos a gente
wisdom
vai conseguindo
that little by
compreender.
little we may be able to better understand. And for us to get closer to Jesus is very important. I remember a talk that Devaldo offered us before the pandemia. And he says, speak of Jesus. That the world needs to listen and to get closer to Jesus. And we need to speak of him, to read about him, to drink the peace that he brought us, his teachings. And we brought that the Beatitudes could be a prayer. May we be able to meditate in each sentence and each one of these Beatitudes. So, because all of these concepts are within us, our path is within us. And I think that's it.
Né, Cláudia? Agradecer a oportunidade de estar aqui.
And just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here with everybody.
Estudo, né, Marluce? Da gente poder ter se
For us to be able to
aproximado,
get closer to the Beatitudes and spend some time
Nós que
studying this.
agradecemos. Thank you very much, Marluce, Claudia, and Dan, for another beautiful study. I also want to send best wishes to everyone who joined us tonight or who will be viewing the record later on. I hope you can all join us on our next meeting for our next study on Spiritism viewed through transpersonal psychology, when Tiago and Mariani will lead our study on reincarnation and unconsciousness and forgetting the past. I wish you all a very good evening and see you soon. Bye for now.